Hi, everybody. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and thank you for coming to my channel. And today I want to discuss again Against Method by Paul Feyerabend. This is part three. And in part three, we're going to discuss chapter 15 and 16 of his book. Chapter 16 is a rather long chapter, and each of these chapters has a 3 to 5 page appendix uh, that is tacked on to the end of them, which has their own interesting ideas. And we're going to start with chapter 15. And chapter 15 is one of my favorites because I really feel like Paul turns to face the camera and really kind of talks to us quite directly about his ideas. And he goes back, I think, to explaining what he means by anything goes and what he means by being against method. And, I think, again, he's talking about this idea that sort of no methodology should be enforced on scientific practice. There's no set of rules. There's no sort of philosophical system that you can build that will fit the history of science completely or will fit scientific practice as it is now. And he's worried that if you try to do that, you're actually going to inhibit science, and you'll actually hurt it in some way and make it less efficient, less useful, less successful. So, again, his anarchism that he likes to describe himself as, it does come with this flavor of actually thinking that science will be better that way, right? So I don't think it's fair to say he wants science to be destroyed and like stop doing science or something like that. He just wants it to be uninhibited, basically. And he starts by criticizing this distinction of the context of discovery versus the context of distinction, which was made popular by the logical positivists, and which Kuhn also criticizes in the first chapter, or at least brings up and says he's going to ignore in the first chapter of his book. And it's interesting because the context of discovery was a way of trying to understand the irrational parts of science, like the aha moments where things just click, or all the kind of irrational things you might do to like jog your creativity and come up with new ideas. They're very much aware of the fact that that's a part of what people do to, practice science at times, and they just sort of package it all in this thing called the context of discovery. After the context of discovery, though, they say you're supposed to go into the context of justification, where you take all those irrational things, all the discoveries you made in that period of irrational discovery and play, and then you systematize it, right? So, and this is the part that Feyerabend just is so frustrated with. He's like, why systematize it, right? It's just the context of discovery is certainly more like what is in the spirit of Feyerabend's point of view. So he gets rid of that in the very first couple of pages. That's not going to do. And he also takes down a few other like classical distinctions and ways of trying to make sense of the philosophy of science, and he gets rid of those. I won't sort of um, get into that, but he wants to get into this idea. He's going to keep talking about this idea that theory and experience are intimately linked and cannot be separated. I wanted to read a little bit of a quote from this part of what Feyerabend says. Um, Theories may be removed because of conflicting observations. Observations may be removed for theoretical reasons. Finally, we have discovered that learning does not go from observation to theory, but always involves both elements. Experience arises together with theoretical assumptions, not before them. An experience without theory is just as incomprehensible as is a theory without experience. Eliminate part of the theoretical knowledge of a sensing subject, and you have a person who is completely disoriented and incapable of carrying out the simplest action. Eliminate further knowledge, and his sensory world will start disintegrating. Colors and other simple sensations will disappear until he is in a stage even more primitive than a small child. So again, he's getting back into this idea that like we can't escape the fact that we have to bring some assumptions to the table. We also need to acknowledge that that means that we can never truly completely separate observation from theory, and we just need to embrace that. I think from Feyerabend's point of view, um, and he really wants to abandon completely the distinction between observation and theory. And you'll see this keeps coming up in chapter 15 and chapter 16, I suspect, in the rest of the book. So you might ask, like, what role should observation play for Feyerabend? It seems like uh, it's not clear. And I think for him, it's just like, we're curious people. We're going to make observations. we're going to do experiments, and if you don't do it, someone else is going to do it. So you're not going to avoid that. And science should involve observations to some degree. He's just saying stop trying to, or what I think he's saying is just like stop trying to systemize it, or try to separate it and make it into this like objective thing. It's just a part of the conversation you're going to have with other scientists, and that's just what it is, right? Like you can't make it into some kind of objective acclaim about the physical world. It just can't be done, right? So just embrace the fact that we're going to do observations, other people are going to observations, and then we're going to meet in the where we're going to just kind of like battle it out and see whose ideas win, kind of thing. Okay, so I think there's no real special place for observation, as far as I can tell, in Feyerabend's point of view, right? And then he also goes into criticizing Popper's falsificationism, and he asks this question like, you can, is it desirable to live in accordance with the rules of a critical rationalism, which is like Popper's views, right? So he's saying I can criticize Popper's views, and he does, but he's also saying, shouldn't we also ask, is this the world we want to live in, right? Which is an interesting question. Feyerabend keeps getting us to try to, um, realize that we're human beings and we should not forget about all these other aspects that make us human and not let science sort of have this tyrannical role over us where they just claim objectivity and truth and all this stuff. And we just have to bow down to the gods of science, right? This is what he's worried about. He's saying, what kind of a world do you want to live in? And what kind of system does one of these systems that these philosophers of sciences have put forth, is that a world that you want to live in? Right? And is that the world that scientists seem to live in themselves? I think it's an interesting question. He also points out that, um, we tend to want to think that when a new theory replaces an old theory, that the new theory sort of just is a larger set of explanations that encapsulates the old theory. But just like Kuhn, he points out that that's just not the way it works in the history of science. Like when we come up with a new theory, oftentimes it explains some things really well, but actually explains a lot less than the old theory did, especially in the beginning, and that the new theory never explains everything that the old theory did, and is never useful in all cases that the old theory does. I mean, Einstein's theory of gravity is a great example of this because we still use Newton's theories of gravity in most scenarios involving the physical world, Earth. Um, it's only like satellites where Einstein's theory of gravity becomes really useful, and then of course studying the universe, it can become very useful. But Newton's theory of gravity is still like a very useful theory, and they don't. It's not like Einstein's gravity completely subsumes Newton's theory, especially not in all like use cases. So he keeps wanting to remind us of the same thing that Kuhn reminded us of, and he keeps talking about how ad hoc hypotheses are needed in science. Let's stop like degrading ad hoc hypotheses. They have to happen from time to time. He defends chaos in science, and I feel like at the end of this chapter, there's just this resounding anything goes, right? Which is the title of his first chapter of this book. For me, I like to think about this in terms of a controlled chaos, um, and that the scientific enterprise, when we look at it, is a bunch of humans and it works, it's useful. But when we look at the details, it's really like this controlled chaos, right? There's all kinds of strong personalities and not so strong personalities, and people who are assholes but really good scientists, and then other people who are really nice. There's all kinds of different personalities, all kinds of different approaches, and they interact in the political spaces of all kinds of different countries and all kinds of different things. And it's all really chaotic, but there's enough of a system there that it works and produces useful ideas, right? And he wants to embrace that. Let's stop trying to delude ourselves into thinking that it's like this apparatus that gets us truth, or is like this black and white oracle that tells us what to do. Instead, let's just embrace the exciting reality of it, that it's just this controlled chaos mess that works. And what's wrong with that, right? I think that's a key to thinking about sort of Feyerabend's personality and what he has to say here. Let me give you a little taste of by reading his quote at the end of this chapter. They give an inadequate account of science because science is much more sloppy and irrational than its methodological image, and they are liable to hinder it because the attempt to make science more rational and more precise is bound to wipe it out, as we have seen. The difference between science and methodology, which is such an obvious fact of history, therefore, indicates a weakness of the latter and perhaps of the laws of reasons as well. For what appears as sloppiness, chaos, or opportunism when compared with such laws, has a most important function in the development of those very theories, which we today regard as essential parts of our knowledge of nature. These deviations, these errors, are preconditions of progress. They permit knowledge to survive in the complex and difficult world which we inhabit. They permit us to remain free and happy agents. Without chaos, no knowledge. Without a frequent dismissal of reason, no progress. Ideas which today form the very basis of science exist only because there were such things as prejudice, conceit, passion, because these things opposed reason because they were permitted to have their way. We have to conclude then that even within science, reason cannot and should not be allowed to be comprehensive, and that it must often be overruled or eliminated in favor of other agencies. There's not a single rule that remains valid under all circumstances, and not a single agency to which appeal can always be made. It reminds me of this idea that like all models are wrong, but some models are useful, right? Feyerabend keeps wanting to remind us, anytime you try to systematize science, you're wrong. You have to be wrong. Your model has to be wrong. It might be useful, and it, we have to conceptualize things, but we should remember that every conceptualization is wrong right from the start. But some are useful, and useful, is great. I think Feyerabend doesn't always lean into this pragmatic side, so that's sort of me putting my own spin on it, but I think it is in the spirit of what he was saying there at the end. So now we move into Appendix 1, and in here he brings up again this idea of separation of science and state. And I want to just kind of link this to something Kuhn said in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that like the scientific education is a very narrow education, a very important education for scientists, but it tends to be a very narrow education. And so perhaps like scientists are important to be a part of the political process. We need these experts to be listened to, like politicians need to listen to scientists. But at the end of the day, maybe we should separate because these scientists have not had this sort of broad education that maybe is necessary to deal with the gray area of life, to deal with the gray area of politics and business and all these like very pragmatic everyday things that we have to do. And perhaps people who studied law or philosophy or literature and these kinds of things are more prepared, perhaps to deal with this sort of gray area of life. And we should look for leaders who can do that. And so these leaders hopefully will consult scientists and get their opinions. But at the end of the day, perhaps scientists are not the best people to ask, are not the best when it comes to setting policy about society. And again, it's an interesting idea. I'm just asking you to consider these questions and suspend your anger for a second if it bothers you, just to try to think about what he's saying and see if you think there's something there worth thinking about. He also has a lot to say about education, and I must say, I like what he has to say about education. He wants to see sort of less rules, less structure, less emphasis on tests and memorization, and more emphasis on play and curiosity. I love these ideas. I really think that, especially at the high school level, we tend to teach students a lot of bad habits in math education. We too often teach them to follow rules, and we forget to help them to think critically. But I'm also a little bit more realistic, I think, than Feyerabend. I love his ideas about education. I would love to have been educated that way myself, but I'm also sympathetic to what a teacher in the high school has to do and how hard that job is. And I'm also sympathetic to, just the very realistic day-to-day things that you have to do to try to teach a classroom of 30 people. And so although I find Paul's ideas very energizing and they resonate with my sort of personality and my spirit, I also want to just acknowledge that education is extremely difficult And um, all these idealistic ideas need to meet the reality of the classroom. And as someone who's been teaching for quite a while, I know that the reality of the classroom often can crush some of your idealistic ideas. And we shouldn't become depressed about it, but we have to keep that tension alive, right? The ideals are important to inspire us, but we also need to make it work, and that's not easy, right? So again, I love the enthusiasm of Feyerabend in this appendix, but I just want to add some clarity to that as well. And he has a lot to say about knocking science off of his pedestal and how science is just the myth of the day. Like he loves to say these kinds of things, just kind of challenging science. He just wants to put science on the same level as like all these other ideas throughout history. And again, it's a provocative thing to say, and it doesn't mean we have to agree, but I think it is worth considering. So now we move into chapter 16, which is this giant chapter. I'm going to try to uh, to paraphrase it and not get too much into it. I like this chapter, but I do feel like it was quite long. But again, he starts with this idea that language is not just a tool, but that language also shapes the very things we're trying to describe as I learned a certain language in a culture, and that shaped me already before I even come to the table. And then when I try to use that language to describe the world, I've already been influenced by the very language that I'm using, this kind of idea, right? And he wants to use this, and he wants to use this in this chapter to talk about incommensurability, which is this idea that also comes up in Kuhn, in the way he said it would, like, you have two different competing paradigms, maybe Newton's theory of gravity and Einstein's theory of gravity. And incommensurability is this idea that both theories cannot completely talk to each other and cannot like meet on some plane of rationality and weigh themselves rationally and then see which one wins. That's not really possible. That each theory sort of lives in its own world in some sense and cannot completely compare rationally. Instead, it has to be done via some other sort of human element. Feyerabend wants to go a little bit further than Kuhn, though, and so he goes into this long chapter trying to explain some of his ideas about incommensurability. And I do find this very interesting. For him, he wants to emphasize this idea that when you have sort of two different cultures, or even just two different periods in history, for instance, or two different paradigms in science, um, they don't completely understand each other. And if you firmly sit yourself in one theory and try to examine another theory, then it's a really unfair fight. You're always going to see the other theory as inferior from your theory's point of view. So he says, what should we do about that? And he recommends that we study these things anthropologically. And what does he mean by that? He says, like, when an anthropologist tries to study some tribe that they're not familiar with, they can't just like go and observe the tribe and try to like explain that tribe through their own language. That is going to fail. They have to try to immerse themselves in the culture of this other tribe, and they have to try to immerse themselves as deeply as possible. They have to try to experience some of the experiences this tribe has. They have to try to speak the language and eat the food and live in the living quarters and do the things that these people do. And again, this is never going to give you a perfect understanding of this tribe. I don't think Feyerabend is claiming that it will, but it's going to at least help you possibly to start to live in those other people's shoes and start to see the world slightly through their eyes. And if you do that long enough, you might start to have your world change a little bit, and then you might be able to get some kind of insight about how these people operate, and then you may be able to express that in the language that you started with. You may have to come up with a new language or new words or whatever, but if you are persistent enough and allow this other culture to wash over you enough, you may be able to describe something useful. But if you just go there and observe for a little while and try to use your language to describe it right away, you're going to fail and you're going to probably mischaracterize them quite badly, right, offensively. And so he's recommending this um, in the sense he talks about the tribe of quantum theoreticians. He says like every area of science, or the big enough areas of science like quantum mechanics and Einstein's theory of gravity and these kinds of things, are enough of a community in themselves that you could study them anthropologically, and you could try to understand their world and their language. And I think it's an interesting idea. Like I think it'd be interesting to try to like study mathematicians anthropologically and see, what you discover, how you describe that. Um, and and again, he's saying that because he thinks if these theories really are incommensurable, that they can't completely talk to each other on this like even plane of rationality, then what else can you do but try to like immerse yourself in another culture? And he uses what he calls archaic man, this in the history before like um, Plato and Aristotle and these Greeks that we think of as like setting the foundation of Western thought. There was a very different kind of culture present, and at times he seems to really romanticize this other culture. It almost seems like he wants us to go back to that culture. I do think there's a lot that he admires about it, but I think at the end of the chapter, his goal is not for us to go back to this like archaic man's culture, but rather to try to appreciate it and try to let some of those ideas wash over us and to let it produce this like pluralism that I think is really undergirding Feyerabend's point of view. That there are just so many different ways of seeing the world and experiencing the world, and we should try to like be curious and experience as many as we can, kind of thing. Um, and some of the things he points out about archaic man is that they were very much in favor of fate. They didn't seem to believe in any kind of free will per se, that they believed that like things were just like a list of facts, like knowledge was just about a list of facts about the world around you. Um, and he celebrates their religious tolerance, that they were happy to just have all these different religions in one place and could accept all their contradictions inherent in these various different religions, being held at one time. Um, and there was though this like sense of an essence underlying things. Like he seems to think that this idea of an essence or this like true nature of things that was introduced by Plato and Aristotle was like a real mistake and caused us to get distracted and blindsided by like looking for truth and black and white certainty and these kinds of things. And he seems to think that that was a real mistake. And he does seem to admire, like in the archaic man, this fact that um, they did not sort of see the world that way, right? And again, so he says you should study science like an anthropologist, not like a logician. Like, don't try to put a logical system on this. Instead, try to study it anthropologically. Try to understand how scientists work as a community. And he also says, like, I can't give you this like perfectly precise definition of incommensurability because it takes time to you have to also let the idea of incommensurability wash over you, and it takes time to for nonsense to build into a language, he says. And you know we have to um, it also reminds me of this idea in Wittgenstein that like there's no truly precise definitions of words. Instead, we get these family resemblances. We just have to give examples until the idea in your mind is sharp enough. The cloud of meaning of what I'm trying to say by incommensurability is sharp enough. And it's like this misconception of this rational school that you can give these precise definitions. Right? You could disagree with that, but that is a big idea in Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. Um, and he says that like Kuhn says something similar about paradigms and that he is fairly similar to Kuhn's ideas. And so we're moving into Appendix 2. Um, but he does sort of explain that there are some differences between Kuhn. So I'll just read part of the end is which is just that the one part that bothers him about Kuhn is that he thinks that Kuhn also put a structure onto scientific history, and so although he agrees with Kuhn in so many different ways, he just doesn't want to put even a structure of like normal science versus revolutionary science on the history of science either, right? So that's the one place where he seems to disagree with Kuhn, right? He wants again to give a defense of chaos in science, this controlled chaos, anarchism, just so it can embrace your curiosity and play, right? Like this is very much Feyerabend. You just see Feyerabend as just a kid wanting to go on the slide swings and just go all over the place. Don't hem me in. Don't put any rules. Let me be and let all humans be, and let's just play in this playground of science, right? And then one kind of big thing that he says is in Appendix 2, before we end here, is that incommensurability is a problem for philosophers, not for scientists. He says that like incommensurability, this idea of trying to reconcile two different theories and whether they can talk to each other is a problem simply because you're trying to systematize science. And then when that fails, you have to somehow explain how these two different systems are incommensurable. But he says, like, for the scientist who's just trying to pragmatically study the world, there's no problem. Like, you don't have to explain because it's not about truth. It's just about pragmatically coming up with useful theories. Of course, not every scientist, I think, feels that way about what science is. But for the pragmatic scientist, I think that is a completely reasonable thing. You don't need to explain, how these theories come together in a systematic way. He also says that, you know, for him, observation statements are not just theory laden, like this idea that it's hard to separate theory from observation, but that for him, they are fully theoretical, that there is no separation between observation statements and theory. And so we need to embrace that. Again, I said that sort of towards the beginning of the of the video, but I wanted to remind you again because that was very important for him. Maybe I'll just end with one more quote here, and then we'll bring it on to the next video. Um, this is about incommensurability. I think that incommensurability turns up when we sharpen our concepts in the manner demanded by the logical positivists and their offspring, and that it undermines their ideas on explanation, reduction, and progress. Incommensurability disappears when we use concepts as scientists use them in an open, ambiguous, and often counterintuitive manner. Incommensurability is a problem for philosophers, not for scientists, though the latter may become psychologically confused by unusual things. So again, I think that's an important point for him, that he thinks that the way that scientists actually practice is very chaotic and irrational. And so there's no need to explain, the incommensurability of two different systems. Okay, that's it for this. I'm going to do one more video on against method. Thank you for checking this out. Let me know what you think. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope to see you at another video.